Okay, thank you everyone for joining. Tonight is a very special night for me in the sense that it is the yahrzeit of my mother. She passed away on the 21st day of Tammuz many years ago in 98. And the Yiddish mama has a very big place in everyone's hearts in our family. She was the matriarch of our family. And thank God, because of her, my sisters and their family and grandchildren. So we're very indebted to her for the life that she lived and for all the values that she gave us and for being the very special partner to my father and the impact they had on my life. So may her memory be blessed. And the shamas, no doubt, have nachas and continue to connect even after they're gone for many years. Certainly think of her very regularly. So this week we're in the portion of Pinchas. Thank you very much, John. In the portion of Pinchas, and we're going to go through a summary, and then we'll pick up on some of the ideas. So let's pick up from where we were last week. Last week we were talking about a portion in which there was an attempt to curse the Jewish people. And Bilam was summoned to be the instrument of that curse, and instead only blessings came out. We said everything was all well. The invincible Jewish people, we would think. Nothing can go wrong because even the worst enemies don't have the power to overwhelm us. And we ended off on a very sad note right at the end of last week's portion. I'm going to mute everybody, and if you need to speak, please unmute yourself. Just make it easier for everybody to hear. So whilst we thought we were invincible, right at the end, the daughters of Midyan arrive and they try and entice the Jewish boys and bring them to not only adultery or to immorality, but also to idolatry. And a plague breaks out, and that's when a leader of the Jewish people stands up defiantly and he consorts with a princess of Midyan, and Pinchas arrives on the scene. And he kills them both. In an act of zealousness, he asks Moshe Rabbeinu. Moshe Rabbeinu says, you act as you know. And he kills them. And as he does that, the plague that had killed 24,000 people stopped. That's how last week ended. It ended with the invincible Jewish people suddenly being very vulnerable, but not vulnerable to the impact of the anti-Semitism and the enemy's intent, because Hashem resolved that very easily, but vulnerable to our own failure and our own commitment to our own devices, to our own vices, to our own negative behavior. So in actual fact, we become the catalyst for weakness, and that is how we ended at the end of last week, with Pinchas being the hero, stopping the plague, but because he jumps up and he takes out this leader of the Jewish people and the woman that he was consorting with. And it's interesting that the Torah puts it on hold and then waits a whole week to tell us what was the response to Pinchas. And that's the name of this week's portion, the portion of Pinchas, because it starts with this powerful personality who stood up when everyone else was silent, including Moshe Rabbeinu, and he acted in a very zealous way, but in so doing, he saved the Jewish people. He turned it around. He actually elicited that strength of character of the Jewish people that turned everything around. He brought us back on path. And Hashem responds to him right at the beginning of this portion. That's where we're picking up from last week's storyline, that Pinchas, who unilaterally executed a Jewish leader and the Midianite princess, point number 2. Point number 3. So this week begins with Hashem giving a reward to Pinchas, and he rewards him with peace and kahuna and priesthood for him and his descendants. Interesting point is, why did he need to be blessed with priesthood? We know that a Kohen's son is always going to be a Kohen, and he came from Aaron HaKohen, so surely Pinchas, being a descendant of Aaron, would be a Kohen. But that was not the case in that very first generation, because in that first generation, it was only the people who were alive at the time that, who were born subsequent to Aaron, that would become Kohanim. Anyone born to a Kohen would be a Kohen. Pinchas was already born, and he was not a Kohen, because it was only for Aaron and for the subsequent generations born after that point. He achieved his priesthood because of this act, this very brave act, this powerful, strong act of standing up for the honor of the Jewish people. And Hashem blessed him with peace and kahuna. We'll come back to that point. Then Bnei Israel are commanded to punish Midyan by hounding and smiting them, which is what happens really next week, and is the very last fulfillment of his role. Moshe Rabbeinu's very last act as a leader was to fulfill the commandment given this week to destroy and to punish Midyan, the nation that had sent their woman to entice the Jewish people and had previously tried to curse us. Then Hashem commands Moshe and Elazar, the high priest, to count all the males over the age of 20. Bnei Israel are counted, and it gives all the totals for each of the tribes. The grand total of all the tribes combined was over 600,000. Then it says that the land of Israel was to be divided amongst those who counted in the census. And then it says that the location of each tribe's portion would be determined by lottery. We'll come back to that point exactly how they divided the land. And then the tribe of Levi were counted. There were 23,000 Levim, males over the age of 1 month. The rest of the Jewish people were counted from the age of 20 years, but Levim were counted from the age of 1 month. Now, having spoken about inheritance, a very interesting episode unfolds. Hopefully we'll come back to it. The daughters of Tzelafchad, there were 5 of them. They came to Moshe Rabbeinu and they said, we are in a unique situation. We've heard all the laws of inheritance, and it says that a father will inherit his land to his children, to his sons. But our father had 5 daughters. He had no sons. What will become of the tribal portion that he's going to receive in the promised land in Israel? When he passes away, there's no sons to give it to. What will then happen? And Moshe Rabbeinu actually says, I don't know what the answer to that is. He goes to Hashem, he asks Hashem, and Hashem says, yes, the laws of inheritance include a daughter's rights to her father's estate if he does not have sons. And so we get a whole new portion relating to inheritance that the woman would receive in a case where there's no sons. And these 5 daughters of Tzelafchad, who appealed for women's rights, were in fact correct, and they would receive the portion in the promised land. Now comes a very sad moment in this week's Shabbos reading, where Hashem says to Moshe Rabbeinu, Lech, you have to go and rise and climb Har HaAvarim, the mountain of Avarim, from where you will be able to see the promised land, that promised land that you so desired and cried and begged and pleaded and prayed for to enter into, but you're not going to enter into the land. You're only going to see it from a distance, from the top of Mount Avarim. And then he would die. So that was going to be, he would go up on the mountain, then he would pass away. Moshe Rabbeinu's response at this point, because he'd come to terms with the fact that he was not going to change the decree that Hashem had made, that he would not enter the promised land. He doesn't now talk about what's fair and not fair, and it's painful, and how am I going to survive this, and it's very hard for me. He doesn't talk about that. What does he focus on? He focuses on succession. How is Bnei Israel going to carry on being a people that will be like a flock that has no shepherd? And if I leave them now, I've played such a central role in leading the Jewish people. How can you leave my people bereft of a leader? Moshe Rabbeinu wasn't worried about himself at this point. He was worried about the continuity and what's going to be after I leave my position of leadership. And Hashem promises him, and he says that Hashem will definitely hand over the succession of leadership to Moshe's most trusted servant, whose name was Joshua. He was one of the 2 spies who went to see the land, him and Caleb, who came back with a favorable report. And the only 2 actually made it into the promised land. The only 2 who had come all the way from Egypt and made it into the promised land. And Hashem promises that he would have the spiritual power, and he would be publicly named as his successor while Moshe Rabbeinu was alive, so that there wouldn't be any doubt later on. It's a big problem when a person does not leave leadership in place after they're not there, and then all kinds of arguments break out, and this was intended, and that was intended. Moshe Rabbeinu wanted to see his successor ensconced in the position before he took leave of this world. Then it seems to veer away completely to a whole section that relates to sacrifices. And it begins by telling us that there are communal sacrifices that were offered in the Mishkan and later on in the temple in Jerusalem at designated times. And these include the fact that there was a twice daily Korban Tamid, one in the morning and one in the afternoon. We parallel those sacrifices with the prayer of Mincha and Shachrit, or Shachrit and Mincha, morning and afternoon. They parallel those two sacrifices. And then it speaks about all the sacrifices that are called Musaf. We know what Musaf. When we say the word Musaf, we think we're talking about the second Amidah, the second Shemona Esrei on Rosh Hashanah, on Yom Tovim, and on Shabbos. The reason why it's called Musaf is because in the temple on those occasions, such as Pesach, Shavuot, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Sukkot, Shmini Atzeret, in addition to the daily offerings, one in the morning and one in the afternoon, there was a musaf. The word in Hebrew, musaf, comes from the word lahosif, to add. There was an additional sacrifice above and beyond the normal two, one in the morning, one in the afternoon, and that was brought because it honored the special occasion of that day, Shabbos, Rosh Chodesh, Yom Tov, Rosh Hashanah, and Yom Kippur. Nowadays that we are unable to bring sacrifices, so our tefillot, keneged, korbanot, they correspond to the sacrifices that used to be brought in times when we could bring them. So we now have an addition, not an additional sacrifice because we don't bring sacrifices, but an additional prayer. That's called a Musaf prayer. That's exactly what we're doing now each time we daven Musaf. And then it presents, since it mentioned all of these chagim in the context of the sacrifice and the additional prayer that is said on those days, it then tells some of the details that relate to those Yomim Tovim. So we're going to go now to some of the details that relate to this Shabbos and the personality Pinchas. And some of these things we actually dealt with last year. We are told that Pinchas is Eliyahu. There's a continuation of Pinchas. His neshama, his soul, carried on in the form of Elijah, Eliyahu, who lived into much, much later times. Eliyahu is a personality that is very well known to us. We know him from the Pesach Seder. Eliyahu, we have a cup of Elijah. We know that Eliyahu, is present at every single bris. And the historical background, why it is that Eliyahu comes to every single bris, is that there was a breakdown between the two kingdoms of the Jewish people in much later years, much later, after the time of Dovid and subsequent generations of the kings. And the kingdom was broken into two parts. There was the kingdom of Israel and the kingdom of Judah. Judea and Samaria, which they call the West Bank, is actually in the Torah called Yehudah v'Shomron, and that was where Judah was. And then there was the area that was for the rest of the tribes of Israel. Amongst the other tribes of Israel, there was a weakening in the commitment to Brit Milah, something that is absolutely essential in the identity of the Jewish people, that men have a Brit Milah, that is the covenant of the flesh that goes back to Abraham Avinu, to Abraham, our forefather. So there was a weakening where people did no longer want to fulfill the mitzvah, and it was Elijah, we're told in the Midrash. Eliyahu brought the Jewish people to once again embrace this all-important mitzvah, and he brought the generations of that time back to the covenant of bris. And the Midrash tells us that as a reward for having reinstated the institution of Brit Milah amongst the 10 tribes, so he, in fact, visits each Brit Milah of subsequent generations. Even till today, his presence, his spirit is with us on the occasion of a Brit Milah. And we actually say the words at a Brit, at the circumcision ceremony, we say the words taken from this week's Parsha, Hineni lo esen lo es brisi shalom, I have given to Pinchas the blessing of peace. And Pinchas is Eliyahu, so we mention the blessing of Pinchas in welcoming Elijah. We also have a special seat at the Brit Milah for Elijah, so we welcome him with the words of the reward given to Pinchas, because Pinchas is Eliyahu. And then we know that Elijah plays another role in history, which is not only retrospective, looking back at history, but looking forward. Because in Malachi we are told, "V'heshiv lev avot al banim He will return the hearts of fathers to the children and the hearts of children to their fathers. He will bring everyone back to the knowledge and the desire and the love of Hashem. And ultimately, he will be the announcer of the world that will be redeemed through Mashiach. So Elijah plays a role historically all the way back to Pinchas and all the way forward to Mashiach. And these words of returning fathers to children and children to fathers, we know that generally children are brought up by their parents, and parents inspire their children to be good, committed Jews. But there are times when that isn't the case because many generations didn't know. In our generation, we have seen more the hearts of fathers being returned through their children than the other way around. There was a huge amount in communities around the world in the 60s, 70s, when there was a Baal Tshuva movement of people coming home where children reminded their parents of their identity. Normally it's parents who remind their children, but Elijah says in the times closer to Mashiach, which is where we are right now, there'll be a time when children will remind the parents and bring them back to the path of Judaism. So we also speak about the blessing that he got, which was for peace. I mentioned this last year as well, so I'm going to say it very much more briefly, that the covenant of peace is written in the words of the Torah, Hineni noisei lo esprisi shalom, and the word shalom, peace, is written in a most unusual way. The word shalom, shin, lamed, vav, mem, shalom, the vav is written in a way that would normally disqualify it as being a non-kosher letter in the Torah, because one of the requirements of a letter that is written in the Torah is that it has to be whole, it has to be complete, and if there's a crack through the letter, it invalidates the letter, and thereby the whole Torah is no longer valid. But on this occasion, the word shalom is written with a vav katia. The vav is deliberately split in half, and when you look at that vav in the Torah, please God, we'll be back at shul, we'll be able to read the Torah inside. The vav is written like a yud with then a break and then a continuation, a broken vav. And for the untrained eye, you would think that the Torah is actually not kosher because it's got an unkosher letter, broken letter, but it is by design broken. So many of the commentaries speak about the fact that the peace that was given to Pinchas was not a complete peace. It wasn't the ultimate peace, and therefore we're showing it is diminished in some way. The shalom is not complete. But I want to share a thought which I think is magnificent and is said by Rav Zevin, who was the author of the Encyclopedia Talmudis, the Talmudic Encyclopedia. My father knew him and had connections with him in Israel. And then when I was a student in Israel, I actually attended his levaya, his funeral. A very great scholar known around the world. Rav Zevin said that the word shalom with a vav and the word shalom without a vav spell two different Hebrew words, connected, related, but different. The word shalom means peace, and the word shalem without the vav means complete and whole. A whole thing and a situation where there's peace between two different things. And he explains that there are two types of shalom. There are two types of peace. There is peace that is a accomplishment of putting different things together that inherently don't belong to one another. They don't actually have a reason to be together other than the fact that they've been joined together through an effort, through an external act, through a treaty, through a maneuver. You've brought together two things that are actually disparate. They are really separate things, and you've brought peace between them. He called that a mechanical peace, meaning that you bring about a peace between different things by joining them together, by welding different parts together. You create a machine that is exponentially greater than the parts that made it up. But if you look at, for example, a car that is made up of all these different parts, true, the car is now the sum total of all of these parts and a much greater, exponentially greater value than the parts add up to, because now they're made into something that is what all of them combine to achieve. But there isn't something inherently connecting the bumper of a car to the steering wheel, other than the fact that things are welded together, bolted together and connected, that is how they become one. But if you look at the bumper, you don't actually detect in it any part of the steering wheel, because they're separate things that have been joined together. Different, however, the word shalem, which doesn't mean peace between disparate things, but means completeness, wholesomeness in something that is essentially one. The analogy for that wouldn't be the parts of a car, but the parts of a human body. Because the parts of a human body are joined together. Their toes on the one end and their fingers on another end, and then there's a head, and there's all the different parts of the human body. But over here, there is something essentially one in the limbs of the body. Because when you prick and you pinch the toe, the head hurts. They are essentially connected. If you study the DNA of the cell of the body on one side of the body, it'll have the same address, the exact same makeup as a cell in the head, because the human body is essentially one. It is united and has made peace, not because you've brought different things together and worked out how you can combine them to work alongside one another. It's much more deep than that. They are inherently one. And the Jewish people, in fact, aspire to realize that we are shalem, which is much greater than shalom. Shalom is when you make peace between enemies, when you make peace between different things, but between two things that don't essentially belong to one another. But because they have common purpose and common goals, you turn them into a united point, and you bring everyone together. That is when it's shalom. But shalem means that I discover that I'm inherently one. And that is what the Jewish people are. So the Rav Zebin says that Pinchas was given this blessing of shalom shalem. The vav is broken to say, read it both ways. Realize that you are shalem, you are the blessing of wholesomeness, which extends way beyond peace. But on the other hand, you need to be able to create the practical application of working peacefully with one another, because you can have the same address in the toe and in the head, but they're actually not pulling in the same direction. So you need peace as well. But it is much deeper than peace. It is shalem. And that's why Hashem gave him the blessing of peace, written in a way that the word could be written as shalom and shalem. Moving on to the enemies of the Jewish people. So we are told that the last battle that had to be fought by Moshe Rabbeinu was a battle against Midyan and Moab, and there were many severe elements relating to the nation of Midyan and Moab that did not exist amongst other enemies. For example, we know that a Midyanite is not allowed to enter into the Jewish people. Even if they want to convert into the Jewish people, they would not be accepted. You would accept from every other nation, not from Midyan. In parentheses, that only related to the men and not to Midyanite women. That was the whole debate that surrounded Ruth, who was from a Moabite. She came from the nation of Moab. She was a Moabite woman. And the people said, how could she convert to Judaism? Because we know that the nation of Moab are not allowed to. But then it was explained that it was only the men that were not allowed to, but the women were allowed to. That was in brackets, but at any rate, Moab and Midyan, the war against them was different. It was the very last war that Moshe Rabbeinu waged. They were not allowed to join the nation of Israel. And that is very strongly contrasted with the enemy that we had in Egypt. It doesn't say anywhere that an Egyptian cannot convert to Judaism, and that there is a possibility of an Egyptian turning his life around, becoming part of Am Yisrael. Why? In the case of Egypt, where they put us in slavery for hundreds of years, treated us so terribly that they killed the boys that were born. They tortured us for hundreds of years. And the people of Egypt, yes, they were punished at the time, but we don't have a long-term residual effect on the people of Egypt. But yes, on the people of Midyan and Moab. What is the difference between the nation of Egypt and the nation of Midyan? And the commentaries explain that the nation of Egypt, they tried to destroy the physical body of the Jewish people. They didn't really care much about the soul. Whatever we believed or we didn't believe, they let it go. They weren't actually interested in what our spiritual affiliation was. They wanted to destroy us physically. The very opposite of Midyan and Moab. They embraced us physically. They sent their daughters to intermarry with our men, as we read in the end of last week's portion. They were intent on corrupting the spirit and soul of the Jewish people. Were they intent on destroying us physically? No, they took us as son-in-laws. They wanted us to live. They were happy to embrace us. They intermarried with us because the Jew had made it. They supposedly made it. We thought this was the ultimate achievement, that we are now accepted by Midyan and Moab. So we actually see that the wars and the enemy that is found in Egypt, the nation that wanted to destroy us physically, is not nearly as bad as the nation that wants to destroy us spiritually. And let's take it out of the context of wars and nations and peoples and put it into our own lives, the enemy. What is the greatest enemy? We often imagine the greatest enemy is the physical threat to our lives. And that's why, look how cautious and careful we are when it comes to defending our homes from the enemy that could, God forbid, invade our homes. We put alarms, we put barbed wire on the fences, we put radio connections and connectivity and electric fencing. We do everything to make sure that the enemy is kept out. And we go through we hold back on no expense and no trouble to achieve that. There's also a spiritual threat to our homes. The spiritual threat to our homes is, what is the information that comes streaming into our homes? What are our children watching? What are the chat rooms that they live in and that they frequent? Who are they speaking to? What is affecting their spiritual well-being? What is grabbing their minds and their hearts in directions that have nothing to do with our value system? So there we're very liberal. We say we don't mind that our children watch the movies and watch the videos and play the video games that could be the antithesis of what we believe in. We don't mind them being corrupted by all of the propaganda that undermines Israel and undermines the Jewish people. And then we say, yeah, it doesn't matter, because when they're older, they'll decide whether they want to this way or that way. I don't have to be the one to force them in any direction. I'll let them choose. But we don't do that when it comes to their physical well-being. We don't say, I'm not going to take them to a doctor and give them their vaccinations and give them their boosters and teach them to brush their teeth. I'm not going to do that, because let them decide later on if they want to brush their teeth or not. We don't do that. We don't say it's optional. And the kid knows that that matters. The kid knows that what is life-threatening when it comes to physical situation, we will not compromise one iota. The kid knows that he doesn't negotiate when it comes to issues that are danger, because there we draw our lines absolutely and firmly, and the kid knows we mean it. When it comes to our spiritual standards, our value systems, we waver. We're not committed. The child knows that we can actually be influenced. If they beg long enough, we'll change our mind. It's not like running into the street where there's traffic and, God forbid, the person can get hurt. That's something that no parent, under any circumstances, never, not on Tuesday, Wednesday, and Sunday, never will they allow that to happen. So the child knows when you say don't cross the road, they know that you mean it. But when you say don't cross the line in a value system, we're not sure if we mean it. The child knows for sure that we're not sure. And therefore, they will push the buttons and they'll push the lines and they'll fight back, because we're not actually sure. We got it all the wrong way around. We do have to take care of our physical situation, and we do have to take care of our spiritual value systems in our homes. But we've got it to the point that we care absolutely when it comes to our physical defenses, and we should do. But that's where we limit it to. When it comes to our spiritual well-being, we actually waver, and we're not 100% sure, and the child knows that it doesn't matter. We should not be allowing the influences on the minds of our children, which is the most valuable thing, which way they're heading, which way they're growing, what do they see as truth? Do they have emunah? Do they have belief in Hashem? That shouldn't be something that we do as a added extra. That should be a vital ingredient in their upbringing, and that is the message we get from Midyan and Moab. Is much more of a threat to the Jewish people than Egypt. And we've said it a number of times that there was debates amongst the rabbis. The Alter Rebbe, who was the author of the Tanya, he was very unique and different in that he did not embrace Napoleon. When Napoleon was taking the world by storm and speaking about emancipation and freedom and opening the world and allowing people to study, and he was an enlightenment to the world. The Alter Rebbe was very concerned about Napoleon. Not that the Tsar was, Russia was good for the Jews. The Jews suffered terribly. But somehow the Alter Rebbe saw the threat of Napoleon to the Jewish people as being more significant and more real in the terms of Jewish survival for centuries. Jews don't talk about surviving 5 minutes. We talk about survival for thousands of years. And for thousands of years survival, we need to protect the soul of our people. And when we lose it, as we've done in some of the freest nations of the world, we've lost as many Jews to intermarriage, Rahman al-Litzlan, as we lost in the Holocaust. It's a terrible thing. We should be bothered by both. Okay, we're continuing talking about the division of the land. And the division of the land had 3 different ingredients. Interestingly, they seem to be redundant because the first step in the division of the land was a rational assessment of the land. They had to know which part of the land was valuable, which was more valuable, which was better fertile, more fertile, which could be used for cattle. And the division of the land therefore had to have some areas being smaller because they were more potent, they were more valuable, and obviously somebody getting arid land would get more land because it would need more land to produce. So there was a division of the land for allotment for the tribes that was rational to determine that every piece of land would be equal. And equal didn't mean in size, it meant equal in value. Then they did a lottery. And interestingly enough, they divided the lottery that emerged, determined the land and determined which tribe would get which part of the land. So it was an endorsement of what had previously been done rationally, dividing the land. Now happened that it was endorsed by this lottery. And then even after the lottery happened, the word that is used relating to the passing of the land to the next generation was inheritance. So we have the rational effect, the lottery, which is super rational. There's nothing predictable in a lottery. And then there is the inheritance. So just taking it a little bit out of its simple context, what this tells us is that the Jewish people have a responsibility to work on all different fronts. There's the rational front. There's an assessment and a calculation, and we need to be calculated. We need to work it all out, and we need to do the utmost we can through the human endeavors and abilities and talents and potential that we have. We need to work it out as people. And then we need to realize that there's an influence in our lives that transcends whatever we know, whatever we understand, whatever we calculate. And that is something that is represented by the lottery, something that happens to us by a power bigger than we are able to calculate. And that is the power of Hashem in our lives that determines things way beyond our ability to predict them and to calculate and to formulate. And then there's even a higher element in our lives, and that is not what Hashem gives us, but inheritance. The difference the Gemara tells us between a gift and an inheritance is that a gift needs a recipient and a giver, and it's only by virtue of that act of the giving that you transfer property or whatever the value is from one to the other. That is for the gift. Inheritance is inherently different. What is different about inheritance is that a son or a child inherits from a parent and stands in the shoes of the parent. It doesn't have to be transferred from one domain to another, because innately, inherently, by virtue of him being the son of his father, he achieves it, and it belongs to him not by a transfer. You don't need, for a gift, you need a moment of handing over, and the person who receives it has to lift it up to show that he has acquired it. There is no acquisition when it comes to inheritance, because the property is inherently part of the son's inheritance, because it is not a transferal of property, it is moving into the space of the parent. And the Jewish people and Hashem have all of these relationships. The rational relationship, which is what we work through by being the fullness of our own ability, the submission to and the surrender to a power bigger than ourselves, represented by the lottery, the power of Hashem determining things way beyond our ability to determine them, and then realizing that all of that is an inheritance. We receive it from Hashem as children of Hashem. That Hashem has given to us the Torah not as a gift, although we call it Matan Torah, but we say Torah Tziva Lanu Moshe Morasha Kilat Yaakov. It is an inheritance to the Jewish people. It belongs to us whether we know and want it or not. A gift you can refuse. An inheritance, it's yours just by virtue of you being the son. We as the Jewish people have the inherent connection to Torah and mitzvahs, which we can never get rid of. You can't actually say, I resign, or I give up, or God forbid, I decide I don't want it, I'm giving it away. It is yours inherently. And those are three elements of our relationship, three circles that govern our relationship with Hashem. So then come the daughters of Tzelafchad, and they say that we've heard all these wonderful words of inheritance, but we have a situation that is unique. As we said before, we don't have brothers, and therefore nobody is going to inherit the land of our fathers, and therefore it's going to be inherited, taken over by other people, outside of our family. And what's interesting about this whole episode in the Torah is that most of the events in the Torah are presented by Hashem. There are a few occasions. Tzelafchad's daughters is one of them, an inheritance. Another one was like Korban Pesach, the people who could not bring a sacrifice, and the story of Pesach Sheni. Those are two examples of mitzvahs that came to us only by virtue of us coming to ask the question. Hashem didn't give us the laws of inheritance relating to women inheriting in families that do not have sons. Hashem didn't give us that mitzvah. It only came about after Tzelafchad's daughters asked the question. So it's interesting, why would there be a part of Torah that didn't come from Hashem automatically? It came from Hashem only after we desired it and we came to ask the question. And Hashem responded to the daughters of Tzelafchad. So what we actually see in the daughters of Tzelafchad is a desire and a love for the land of Israel, which reflects the woman's innate and natural love to the holy. I say it in no patronizing way, and there are a number of women who are here tonight, that it was time and time again the woman who kept the Jewish people on the straight and the narrow. Remember, in the time of Egypt, when the men had lost hope, when people had separated from their wives and found that it was useless to bring children into the world, into such a world, the world of Egypt, the world of slavery, and sons being thrown into the river. What a useless operation to bring a child into the world. Men gave up. Who was it? It was Yocheved's daughter, Miriam, who arrived on the scene and says to her father, you have decreed not only against the boys that they will become extinct, you've decreed against the girls as well. It was a young girl who gave the inspiration for life to continue. And even as the men were broken by the hard work in Egypt, it was the woman who kept life going. And it was the woman who did not contribute to the golden calf. And it was the woman who came forward in the donations even faster than the men. And again, when it came to the love of the land, it was the men who failed, sent spies, and who came back and said, we don't want to take the land. But the daughters of Tzelafchad, they represent the woman who said, we do not give up, and we do want to have the goal, and we do believe. And it says that ultimately when we sang at the crossing of the sea, Moshe Rabbeinu sang the song, but then Vatashar, and then Miriam sang, but Tupimu Bimchalot, not only did they sing, they sang with musical instruments accompanying them, which Kabbalistically and by all the commentaries mean that the joy and the expression of gratitude of the woman exceeded that of the men. There's an innate spirituality and a connection to the holy that is brought to the family and brought to the community by the power of woman. And this love of the Jewish people for the land of Israel was manifest more so in the daughters of Tzelafchad than anybody else. The daughters, they were the ones who realized what it meant to have a part of the land. And that added dimension needed to be elicited by the love and devotion of people. And that tells us that sometimes Hashem gives it to us because it is initiated by Him, but sometimes Hashem responds to us. So we shouldn't think that we should be shy of expressing our devotion and our love, even beyond the letter of the law, because ultimately that elicits from Hashem an even greater degree of giving and a greater gift. So they were the ones who petitioned and received a whole new part of the land for them, a new part of the Torah for all of us because of their love and devotion to the land. I want to share one more thought about the daughters of Tzelafchad, and then one more thought about life generally as we find ourselves right now. The daughters of Tzelafchad said that our father died, ki bechet omet, our father died by his own sin, v'hu lo haya ba'adat Korach, and he was not amongst the people who rebelled against Moshe Rabbeinu when it came to the rebellion and the revolt of Korach. My father always used to say, why did Moshe Rabbeinu not know the law? In answer to the daughters of Tzelafchad, why does it say, he said, I'm going to ask Hashem and I'll come back and tell you. Moshe Rabbeinu knew everything. Why did he need to ask Hashem in this case? My father used to say that a person is never allowed to pass judgment in a case where there is a leaning towards one side over the other. A judge cannot look at those people that come before him and have a relationship or a connection to one side. He has to then recuse himself from the whole judgment because he's no longer objective. My father used to say objectivity is lost not only in the physical gift. A guy comes to the judge and says, yeah, I'm a judge, I want to give you the special case of wine, or I want to give you a few thousand rand, or I want to bribe you with this, subtly, whatever. And as a result of that, the judge has to recuse himself because he got a physical asset. My father always used to say it's much more subtle than that. When the daughters came to Moshe Rabbeinu and said, please tell us what the law is. And by the way, extraneous information, our father never rebelled against you, Moshe Rabbeinu. We were on your side. As soon as Moshe Rabbeinu heard them endearing themselves to him by virtue of them having a connection, relationship to Moshe Rabbeinu said, I can no longer make the assessment. You have ruined my ability to be the objective judge, and I'm teaching this to the Jewish people because you added that extra information that was not necessary for the question, and thereby you endeared yourself to me and made me a judge that can no longer be a judge for your question. And therefore he asks Hashem, and Hashem then tells him what to do. I want to finish off with just a few words. We spoke about emunah and we spoke about faith, and we find ourselves in extraordinary times. A few of us were talking just before we began the shir, how we're all suffering, watching people around us suffer, loss of life, loss of health, and stories that are unfolding one after the other. And I want to share a few words that I heard from Rabbi Simon Jacobson just before Shabbos. He was addressing the fact that in the last months, a lot of things have collapsed. Just after Pesach in Meron, there was a collapse of the grandstands over there, and it's resulting in a stampede, and there were people killed. People died in the stampede. It was a horrific event in Meron on Lag BaOmer. A month later, there was a shul in Yerushalayim, the Hasidim of Stolin, who was celebrating Shavuot, and there were many people standing on top of bleachers, and it collapsed, and people died. And now we've had a collapse of the building in Miami, in the heart of the Jewish community, and there are 150 people unaccounted for, and 10 people dead, and it's a very dire, terrible state. And this is coming after all the tsaros of the collapse of being able to live normal lives, of going to shul and going to school and going to work. So the suggestion that Rabbi Simon Jacobson was saying is that we need to think when things around us are collapsing, when the structures that we expect and we want to rely on are not the structures that we knew them to be. When the things are falling down and falling apart, we need to strengthen the structures of our lives. And the structures of our lives are to be built on emunah, on faith in Hashem, on commitment to the values of the Torah, on the commitment to our relationships in our homes, in our marriages, in our connection between parents and children, in our value system. It's an opportunity for all of us and a demand of all of us to look at the structures of our own lives, because there is a spiritual parallel to things that happen in the world. And that's not about blaming ourselves, and it's not about accepting upon ourselves responsibility in a way that breaks us unnecessarily, blaming. We're not talking about superficial blaming. We're talking about wake-up moments in life where we can look at our lives and say, if things around us are falling apart, are we building our lives and our value systems to greater heights than we have in the past? And that would be the desired response to times of difficulty. And may Hashem respond to all of our prayers and all of our deepest prayers for the health and the well-being of our loved ones, and for Am Yisrael and for the whole world to be able to come past this pandemic, come past the tragedies that have befallen people around the world, and Am Yisrael and our Jewish people, and the difficulties in Israel, and the war in Israel, and the anti-Semitism, and all of the things that we deal with. It should not allow us to become weaker and to become broken. It should elicit in us a determination to build the structures of Am Yisrael to greater heights than we've done until now. And that will have made an impact, indelible impact on our lives for good as a result of the challenges we're going through. May Hashem give us the strength to do so. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you for joining us, for being part of the shir, and have a beautiful week ahead.
Amen. Thank you. Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi. Fantastic.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a wonderful Shabbos.
Shalom,
Not everyone.
Tov.